You're welcome.
I'll chuck it up there after I've got the... Oh god, someone's been actually storing files on this computer. Ready? Yeah, I think so.
Boom, done.
Alright, do I sit for this or do I stand?
Use your skill and judgment to decide.
And how... It was up there, wasn't it?
There was like a loading screen.
Yeah, it's up.
Hey!
There we go. What is it with lecture theatres and doing the dual screen thing? I can't just like point up, I have to point both directions. Yeah. Why? Cool. Everyone ready? Drop that a bit because it's really, really high.
Are we recording this, by the way?
God, I hope not. I'm going to swear so fucking much. I hope it's not being recorded.
No, it's just, I think we put it in like an ad executive like page. Yeah, we just put it in the executive. We can speak out.
That you don't have a large enough team for that. Okay. Cool. All right. So this kind of summarizes how I used to think about trade and economic development when I was in my first few years of university debating. You will hopefully have a slightly better grasp on it than that, but particularly in the novice years and the slightly intermediate years and the first couple of worlds years and then shortly after you retire, you tend to think about economics as like mechanisms you've heard of, something, and a country gets richer. Or people complain about trade for some reason, blank, and people continue to bicker about trade afterwards. So we're going to try and fill in some of the gaps. I'm going to be assuming like a relatively basic understanding of economics, but I'm not going to be going over like core principles of supply and demand, competition, etc., etc. So hopefully everyone has that rudimentary level of knowledge in an intermediate session. Just some brief disclaimers. Firstly, I'm not an economics student, or worse still, an actual economist. I am a nerd with a lanyard, so take all of what I'm going to say with a pinch of salt. Secondly, the answer to a lot of questions when it comes to IR and trade is like shades of grey. Yes, that's true, but not all the time, or but not really. In a lot of debates, things are painted as absolute that are so incredibly nuanced, there isn't enough time to prove or disprove them. So a lot of the ways you win trade debates is by having the dominant characterization, even if it's not necessarily true or fully developed in nuance. The third thing is you might have heard that debates are like iPhone games because there's like, they change the superficial details, but at the core there's only like 5 or 6 different clashes. That's definitely true of trade debates, but mostly they're like iPhone games because they suck. They're really, really boring and dense, so I'm going to try and keep this lively, but the more interaction we get going, the more tolerable this experience is going to be for you. And especially, like back in my day, we used to spend entire weekends on this before Australs. The world is very big and a shitload of stuff is happening in it. So as much as you can tell me and ask me what it is you want to learn, the more I'll be able to help you. So yawn obnoxiously if I'm going over stuff that you've heard a million times, or don't hesitate to ask questions or to probe deeper. What is it you guys want to learn about? What are some topics that you hate? Throw them at me. Economics. Specific economics.
I don't understand anything to do with interest rates. I have no idea what they do or why they're important.
Yeah, they're not.
Oh, good.
Just like a follow-on to that, what is the Reserve Bank and why do we have it?
That's actually a good question.
Okay. I get the feeling this session may have been mismarketed because it's mostly going to focus on developmental economics, but the Reserve...
Is foreign direct investment a thing?
It's several things, in fact, yes. All right. To briefly answer those questions, the Reserve Bank is the supply of money, and it creates how fast the economy does certain things, and it can make certain things go faster and certain things go slower, depending on what it does. Google the rest. Is foreign direct investment a thing? Yes, sometimes, but not always. See that second dot point on this slide? Okay, cool. So, let's start with what is sort of the archetypical narrative of development, which is Rostow's 5 stages. This is sort of the classic historical example of everything that the Western nations did in the early years, going through industrialization and turning into the gluttonous slobs that we are today. So the first stage is a traditional society where basically everyone has to produce everything that they eat or wear or live in. There's very little productivity, and people basically prepare for themselves the things that they need to survive. Maybe there's a little bit of trade, like someone will do all the fishing and someone will do all the knitting and they'll swap, but there's no capacity to sell things. You just have the bare minimum you need to get by, and you have to work very hard to produce it. It's very difficult to point to entire countries today that still look like this. Like, nothing we would consider a state fits that description. Isolated villages or places that have been ravaged by war, maybe, but almost every country that you will talk about in the debate is at least at the second stage of economic development, which is preconditions for takeoff. You've got some mechanization going on. Suddenly 1 hour of labour is able to produce more things, and you sell those things for a profit that get invested in the production of better things and better technology. The kinds of countries that fit this description nowadays are mostly like some of the more remote South American countries, lots of places in sub-Saharan Africa, most of the countries in Central Asia, things that you will typically focus on when the topic is referring to less developed nations. What are some of the preconditions for takeoff? Usually you've got fairly cheap labour and not massive employment, so there's a lot of opportunity to get people enrolled in the workforce. It's relatively low wages and low working conditions. There's some technological advancement, but investors can bring in a lot more. And a very small percentage of, and there's like some amount of savings that are going into funding the GDP. This is, when you think of a trade or development debate, this is usually where the focus is going on, these sorts of countries. And your debate is about the best way to take them from stage 2 to stage 3, or from stage 3 to stage 4. Age of mass consumption at the very bottom there is mostly talking about the United States, Australia. We are very massive consumers of stuff, and we throw lots of it away. And that's very bad, but, you know, separate topic. Environmentalism is for later in the year. So this is sort of the archetypical story of development. This is what most people instinctively kind of think of when they come to the story of how does a country get richer, how does its people get healthier. It's not particularly important to be able to define those stages, but having a rough idea of what they look like, creating more mechanization, driving productivity, being able to make more stuff with the same amount of labour is basically what we mean when we're economically developing a country. We're becoming more productive. But that's not really the point, because when we define developing a country, we usually have some objective other than just making more things and selling more things. And a whole subgenre of debating is what should development look like and what should it focus on? Who's ever done a topic like we would prioritise political development over economic development, or a strong dictatorship over a weak democracy? Anything like that, where it was kind of making people richer versus making people freer? Have you done those sorts of debates before? Yeah? Yes? Sorry? Like half debates?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay. Have you done them not well, but you've had the topic presented to you? Yeah. So there's a lot of different objectives that might be economic development. Eradicating poverty, for example, getting rid of disease, making people well enough that the infant mortality rate isn't terrible, is going to fit into most people's definition of developed. But after that, you sort of get into a bit of a philosophical distinction. You have some economists who will argue that getting more stuff, the accumulation of material wealth, is what we mean when we say economic development. You also have a lot of debaters that kind of instinctively assume that that's what we're talking about when we're talking about developing a country, is making it richer and giving it as much stuff as the United States throws away in the average week. But what's the point of that per se? Is having more stuff what's important, or is what's important making sure that people have access to opportunities that will make them happy, that they get a say in who their government is, that they can hold their law enforcement and institutions accountable? And often there's a trade-off that exists between those two things. Debate topics will present you with a mechanism that might make your country more accountable to its people, might provide them with more freedom and opportunity, but will make it harder for them to accumulate stuff, or will shift the material wealth of some people to other people who won't be able to do as much with it. So can anyone think of any reasons why that might be a trade-off that exists? Using what you know of economics, why might those sort of clashes be common? Yes, the economist is putting his hand up.
When you build a factory or lots of development, you have to pollute local places or tear down trees to do that.
Yeah, so often progress demands sacrifice in the form of environmental conditions or in the form of working conditions for that labour, yeah.
If you are going to make more happiness and freedom and say you only have to work this many hours a week and you get really high wages, there's less of an incentive for factories to open up there and exploit your cheap labour.
Yeah, we don't have manufacturing at universities because we all believe in a universal basic income. Yeah, so when these debates pop up, often the strategy on the part of teams is to say, well, we can have both. If we focus on the economic development, the political and social benefits just kind of flow down from that wealth. Or you'll have the freedom-loving side saying, if we make the country healthier, get rid of corruption, make everyone more happy and more willing to contribute, then we'll be more efficient in our economic activity. The clash of that is sort of the classic trickle-down economics story versus Debaterland, and I honest to God don't know if there is a real-world example of Debaterland, because most countries tend to focus, at least in the first stages, on economic development rather than social development. Yes?
Bhutan's an example of getting the local scenario right. They just tax tourism very heavily and then make it like a very nice paradise to visit.
Kind of, but it's not a good example of like getting all the way to full industrialization and mass consumption, though. It's still struggling with that step.
Yeah, they're the opposite. They take the lower.
Yeah. But the point here is that you usually try to get the clash of, if we get to mass consumption, we'll then use that money to make people free. There isn't really a real-world example of using the liberalisation to make people rich, although arguably there isn't really a real-world example of using the money to make people free, because often the problem that countries get sucked into is, when do you stop? When do you have enough material wealth in your GDP that the focus needs to come on redistributing that wealth amongst everyone? Never does, really, does it? The wealthy start to control that country. And so this is part of the clash of the debate, is like, is there an exit strategy for that scenario? Or are you an economist like, what's his name? Who was it? Doesn't matter. Sorry? Yes. Who believes that you need to be equal and egalitarian about that wealth as it's created, otherwise hierarchies are going to form and social problems are going to be exacerbated rather than resolved. So the real-world sort of comparisons of this are like China, India, and Pakistan, who started developing seriously around about the same time, and went with fairly radically different approaches. China, obviously authoritarian, its citizens have very little say in what goes on. Their government is kept accountable in that people will get outraged if they don't develop the country, but they don't get to vote for their leaders, they only have like fairly minor representation. But it's been a pretty healthy example of economic development, hasn't it? It's gone from a very small GDP per capita to one of the richest countries in Asia overall. Contrast that with India, that politically has liberalised quite a lot in recent history, and there's been some effort on the government to put money into developing the economy, but the average citizen is still very, very poor. Security of job and procurement of a wage is fairly low, let alone like people having the access they need to clean drinking water in rural areas. So India has lots of freedom, but not much stuff. China has lots of stuff, but very little freedom. Pakistan is kind of the baseline against which you compare them both, because it hasn't had a huge amount of economic development, and in the early years focused very much on social freedom and treating its citizens egalitarian. And for a while, even though it wasn't as wealthy as India, its citizens did have access to a higher level of education and life expectancy. But in recent years, that's kind of plateaued. They haven't been able to drive the economy the same way that China and India have by focusing on it. So the long and short of this is that in a given topic, you might be the side arguing that we want greater economic development, and that's often what the topic will instinctively steer you towards, you might also be the side arguing that money and stuff isn't as important as making sure that the country is free of corruption or that people are happy and have their basic needs met. And you can contrast those ideas against each other, as well as you can argue about what is the best strategy for making the country richer and more economically developed. But you have to be willing to wear the consequences of that trade-off. So when formulating your case at the beginning of prep time, decide for yourself which camp you sort of fall into. And that might open up lines of opposition that you wouldn't otherwise see if you thought this was just a debate about what's the best way to make a country richer. Any questions about the contrast of those two philosophies? No? Have you heard all of this before? Oh.
Just a thought about an example for the high human development index rate of development as opposed to the economic index rate of development. Kerala province in India is often cited as the best example of that, where the state pursued extremely high levels of education, healthcare and so on at the expense of economic development. And whether or not that has been good for those people is something that you can all research on your own.
Yes, and we've got some other India examples coming up, so that's a case study.
Stop pronouncing it right, don't worry. Sorry? Stop.
Whatever. Okay, good.
Yep. All right. Now let's talk about what the best paths to getting the country economically developed are. A very common one that you see in debates is sort of a high level of government intervention and driving of that economic engine versus hands-off free market liberalism, just let investors and let natural markets develop the economy of your country. The real-world comparison of this is two other Indian provinces, Gujarat and Karnataka. You might be more familiar with Bangalore. That's a city within Karnataka. Gujarat was Narendra Modi was in charge of its economic development, and it basically said this is going to be an investor's paradise with very little red tape. Karnataka went the opposite. The government specifically decided we're going to be an IT giant, we're going to bring in lots of experts and university professors to teach our population, we're going to focus very heavily on investment in that sector, we're going to try and draw in a lot of IT expertise, and they stole a generation of programming jobs from the United States, so good on them. Those are two relatively contrastable real-life examples of those two philosophies. So what are some of the reasons that they are better than one another? So screw the free market, you want to be a government investing in your country. What are some of the reasons, aside from ignoring for a moment that I've put some up there, that you think the government might be a better driver of economic development than the market? Who's got some ideas? Yeah. Yep. So broadly, economists agree that a strong middle-class consumer base is important to economically developing. A government that is accountable to its citizens is more likely to distribute that wealth evenly rather than isolate it in the hands of a few, and so the growth will be fueled by lots of people being able to buy and sell goods and services. Equal distribution is good. Free markets tend to reward the people who already have money the most, a lot more than a government deliberately pick and choosing what to do with that capital. I mean, the fact that it can tax them isn't really an incentive, it's more what it wants to do with that tax as to what its incentive will be. An ethical government that wants to provide for its citizens obviously needs a meaningful tax base to enable it to do that, so you can sell it that way. If you're dealing with a corrupt regime and you want to characterise it as if we make everyone richer, they have an incentive to be on board with that. They're probably not going to make as much money from taxing the working class as they would just sort of investing that money in their own mine and private estate. Yeah.
This is a weirdly niche example, but I know that Norway apparently has state control of their dairy, the dairy production, in the entire state. Can you say in countries where they're really small and they've got a lot of competition, with other countries surrounding them, that the government controlling a market enables that country to invest in itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what that first dot point I've got there is that, if you're a private market actor, let's say you want to manufacture widgets in Uganda, you will buy steel from the cheapest producer because what you're after is a bottom line investment. Whereas if you're a government in a country, you might be willing to spend a little bit more money to make the steel mining industry that provides the materials for your widgets. Similarly, a state-controlled industry has additional resources and support to help it compete with larger international giants where the free market is just somewhat discriminatory. And so if you're a country who's less developed in an area already dominated by imported foreign goods that are sold at a really low price because of manufacturing, state support might be the only way you can get that industry off the ground in the first place, because you need protectionist policies. I don't know much about Norway and its dairies, but it sounds plausible. And there are certainly countries that subsidise a sector that is particularly critical to their economy. We know that Australia did that with its car manufacturing sector for quite a while. The US and Europe still do that with their agriculture today. What's another reason that the government driving economic development might be a good thing, as opposed to the free market? Yep.
Because they're more likely to invest in things like education and healthcare that private entities would not, because it's not as profitable.
Well, yes, but we'll assume that under the private model, they're like still taxing those corporations enough to then invest the money into that. Well, we're talking more about the apparatus and the actual decision making. Yep. Boris?
The government should lock people into the regions comparative advantage. So say high labor in those areas. These people aren't doomed to working factory jobs for the rest of their lives.
Ooh, in reality, not so much. Like, often, even if you're a state-driven company, you need to build where it's most productive. Even if you're not deliberately discriminatory, the reality that your capital cities are closer to ports often means that that's where you put the bulk of investment. Perhaps in the later stages of development, that's a little bit more true. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a definite advantage to the government driving the engine, though. Yep.
There's an interesting, it's kind of around this, it's not taking any particular side, but I watched the short documentary about the push to renationalise England's rail system, and they had a huge discussion about like how back, that one guy made the comment, he was just like, oh, all the people that want to renationalise it, the people that went around back when it was nationalised, there was that day where it's just like, if an asset is controlled by the government, and there's no competition, there's no incentive, apart from public outrage, to increase the quality of the rail cars, right? But the problem was, as soon as they privatised it, they split like this one entity to like 25 different competing entities, and they split the people who own the rails from the people that own the cars. And what that meant was that, sure, that like people have used it more, right? There's more people using the rails now than there were back, and then they privatised in like 92 or whatever. But the problem is that it's just hugely inefficient, because they don't have one body doing all the signalling, and they don't have one body that can fix the rails when it's the rails' fault the cars aren't running on time.
And same with air traffic control, right? Like there is a role for natural monopolies within the economy. They tend to be a fairly minor facet of debating. Occasionally you can get a dispute about whether or not a government can run an industry efficiently, or whether we should privatise it. An important thing that often gets overlooked, and I've got it up there in the brackets, is that even if the debate is asking you to like put the government in charge of something, that doesn't mean they can't use like a private actor to do it. They just usually impose a contract that has very favourable conditions. Like, we're going to let you run this government-owned service, but you work for us. You're going to employ our citizens, you're going to make them really high quality, or we're going to can you and get another contractor in. Usually that's method of privatisation, that's the method we use for like the train system here in Melbourne, right? It's like, there's no competition between multiple actors until that contract is starting to run up and consumers are getting like sick of the service that's being provided and stagnating. Yeah.
So when we say screw the free market, what we're talking about with the free market is the use of multinational corporations to finance your investment, to come in and take control of the natural resources of your country and the workforce of that country. And these people are evil in quite a lot of cases. There's a reason why they keep dumping oil into rivers in Africa when they do their mining there, because their interest is only in extracting as much profit from that country as possible, irrespective of its social consequences. And when we say we should open things up to the free market, what that means is getting rid of the environmental protection laws that would disincentivize people from acting that way. It means allowing favourable tax breaks with them. It means allowing them to have access to lobbying in that country, which often corrupts it. Just attack corporations if this is your side of the debate, guys.
So it's about managing externalities, like the fact that a government is also interested in quality of the route system, and is also
that's definitely a core argument of the pro-government-driven development side, is that like your interests are not purely profit; they are for people, for the environment, for the quality of cities, for law enforcement, for stability. But now let's flip to the other side of the coin, which is you really, really like the free market and view it as substantially attractive. What are some of the reasons why private investment and private development might be better than the government developing it? Okay, go for it.
Governments are evil. They're often extremely discriminatory. They're often racist and controlled by racist nationalist parties. They often are extremely bad at looking at market signifiers. They often give sweetheart deals to their own particular friends, irrespective of whether or not they'd be good. They create oligarchies. They centralize political power. They're terrible, evil people. Corporations are the win.
Yeah. So governments can be evil, private companies can be evil, and a lot of debates boil down to which is more evil or less evil. Though evil is like a relative term. Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, at the time when they went through their economic booms, none of them were what we would call like representative government. They were all very authoritarian. I think the current president of South Korea is like the daughter of the general who was overseeing its economic development. Something like that. So they have a really long-lasting legacy of unaccountability and authoritarianism. They might be effective at what they do, and they might not necessarily be evil. It might just be sort of an incidental byproduct of the way that they developed the country most efficiently, that there are certain disenfranchised minorities, or that they don't give people a lot of authority to speak out against them. That can be explicitly rigging elections. That can be informally rigging elections by, like, for example, Singapore's method of, in order to run in elections, you have to not have a criminal record or have declared bankruptcy. If the government decides to suddenly investigate you for antitrust for 7 years, that could drive you into bankruptcy pretty quickly. Regimes that have power tend to not like giving it up. Whereas with private actors, there are some pretty clear boundaries on what they're allowed to do when they invest in a country. They might be siphoning off lots of wealth, they might be very profit-driven, but they don't control the government in the same way as someone who is literally the president or the cabinet. What's another less commonly cited reason why the private actors might be better than the government is that when a government doesn't operate on the same level as private actors when it comes to things like getting loans from banks or accessing natural resources. And what I mean by that is, banks are always more interested in lending money to governments, to countries, than they are to private businesses, because it's much less common for a government to default on its loans, because it has the power of taxation. And it's much more likely that if the government tries to be the prime industrial driver, it's going to develop a monopoly over access to those funds in the local banks, or experts that can properly implement that mining infrastructure, or just the natural resource wells. And eventually, you will have to start developing a private market. There's very few people who argue for like permanent state-run monopolies in all industries once you start to hit that age of max consumption. And so you need enough freedom and enough access to resources that make the market competitive that when you start to make that transition, you can provide viable competition. A good example of that kind of going on at the moment is China. It's sort of done all it can as a state that drives and manipulates its use of cheap labour and state-funded enterprises. What it now really needs is middle-class consumers buying from competitive private competitors in order to drive its economy anymore. But it's hard for new businesses to emerge, given that most of the existing titans had state backing for so many years and have a very entrenched amount of power. Or to use a more global example, China has a pretty severe monopoly on the production of rare earth metals, not so much because it's the only country that has access to them, but because it was able to undercut its competitors with backing from its state for so many years that all of its competitors sort of declared bankruptcy or shut down, and it's going to take a really huge amount of money for, say, a competitor in California to start up again. They have very recently started to do that. But for a very long time, China had a very firm monopoly over it because there wasn't enough competition ongoing throughout its economic development. So that's kind of the trade-off there, is you can't permanently have the government in charge of things, but it is going to destroy competitors if it has that much backing. And also the government just sometimes picks really shit companies that do a bad job even without competition. So that's kind of a broad overview of the clash between those two debates, of the government-driven approach or the free market approach. Lots of topics explicitly ask you to compare these two philosophies when you're debating. Some topics don't, but you can bring it into the debate. For example, there's a lot of debates that involve loans from international organisations like the IMF or from the World Bank, or bailouts to Greece from the EU, which attach conditions to those loans. Some debates will explicitly ask you about whether those should just be free money or should we attach conditions to it. And usually, most Western-controlled aid operates under what we call the Washington Consensus. Has anyone heard of that? Has anyone under the age of 30 heard of that? So, the Washington Consensus is a list of principles that, in practice, are mostly used by the World Bank and the IMF that very heavily push free market liberalism as the passage of trade. So, when those organisations lend money to a developing country, they really require them to deregulate their markets, put a lot of the power of development into the hands of private actors, and most importantly, to offer global free trade within the borders of that country, meaning you can't use the government to protect your local industries or put tariffs on imports. So you can sort of bring this clash into a debate, even if it's not explicitly stated in the topic, as a way of deepening your analysis. Yes, Mary?
So when you talk about the IMF conditions that Bolivia had to privatise its water supply, you can just bring in how economic liberalism is the worst.
Yes.
As well as you're literally privatising water.
Yes. Yeah, pretty much. So that's two ways that this clash often plays out in debates, explicitly and subtextually. The other thing you can often do is when you're talking about a specific country, you can characterise how good the regime in that country is. You guys have probably got a lot of debates about Zimbabwe coming up as we head into Australs with the recent ousting of Robert Mugabe. If you portray ZANU-PF as being very isolationist, very protectionist, then a screw the free market approach is not a very good way of developing that country, is it? Because you'll have this authoritarian actor with all the money and all the power in the country, and the West is just providing support to that regime. If, on the other hand, you portray it as a necessary thing to drive the development of Zimbabwe in an area of the world where most of its neighbouring countries are a lot richer and a lot more competitive economically, maybe some state protectionism is the only way to make it competitive with South Africa or Botswana. So you can characterise the actors, or for that matter the private companies within that country, in a way that also invites this clash in the debate. So these are places you can go for more material if you've heard the topic of the debate is something like we should attach liberal conditions to aid for Uganda, and you're just sort of thinking, how the hell are we going to talk about this for an hour? We know nothing about the country. Logically and intuitively, government good, private actors good provides you a lot of material that you can talk about, even in an abstract sense, if you don't know the specifics of that country. Any questions about the clash between those two ideas? No? Oh yeah, and that's what I was just talking about. Okay, so now let's get into some of the nuts and bolts. What are some of the problems with development, and why are some countries still really, really poor? Firstly, natural resources. You might, and I know I certainly did at a young age, sort of instinctively think, well, surely having natural resources makes it easier to develop because you've got a thing that you can sell. Yes and no. Countries have successfully developed without the wealth of natural resources, and countries with a wealth of natural resources have nothing vaguely resembling development. So while it can be a benefit, it creates at least as many problems as it does solutions. The classic examples here would be Zimbabwe and Congo, which are quite rich in natural resources, in contrast to Switzerland and Singapore. Anyone want to tell me what the major natural resource of Switzerland is? Chocolate and Nazi gold don't count. What have we got?
Cows.
Yeah. So these are countries that developed despite not having a wealth of natural resources to lean back on. Meanwhile, natural resources can be a huge obstacle to development if you don't have the means of managing them properly. What are some of the reasons for that? Number one, I'm going to do them in the reverse order of what's up there on screen. Number one is conflict over ownership of those resources. If your country's economy is dependent on a really long supply chain of manufacturing, marketing, and distributing a product, you can't fight over that. You need a large body of workforce within your country committed to extracting resources, manufacturing them into things, taking them to a global trade centre, and distributing them to the rest of the country. A small militia cannot walk in with guns and take that over. Very different for a mineral mine. Doesn't require a huge number of people to start getting the resources out of that, or slavery is another option for forcibly getting the resources out of that. And particularly in the Congo, there are examples nationwide of militias taking control of mines through force and using the funds to buy guns and continue that war effort. Natural resources are a lot easier to steal than functioning labour markets, which means that if your country's main appeal is its natural resources, there's going to be budding conflict over who controls access to them. So ideally, you want large economic machines that require the country to be cooperative and that require the government to maintain stability in order to develop your country. The second reason that natural resources can be a trap is called Dutch disease. Who's heard this term? Okay. Peter, do you want to tell us what it means?
When one industry booms and they export, that boosts your currency so that every other thing you sell is too expensive comparatively.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
in Australia.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's sort of like having a really strong teammate carry you at a competitive tournament, right? Like, it's great for the first round, but then you're suddenly facing an entire team of World Sydney speakers, and you're like, oh shit, we're screwed. The mining industry or the fossil fuel industry gets so far ahead of the rest of your economy that it makes your currency more and more valuable and harder to trade, whereas most of your industries are still really poor, and it makes everything else very uncompetitive to export. So, whilst you might want to use natural resources as part of your economic development engine, you need to do the other things as well. And a big trap with natural resources is that countries focus very, very heavily on just those natural resources. Yemen is kind of an example of that. Very, very big into the fossil fuels industry, and there was kind of outrage when they tried to steal control of the World Cup and hosting ceremony, because they don't have much else to offer tourists. They're going to have to very quickly build that right now, and they're doing it mostly via slave labour, because they can't afford to pay the workers to build the five-star hotels at that rate. And lastly is lack of diversity, which is kind of similar in that you want other things happening and not just that natural resource industry. But the main reason that I flag this as a separate problem is because even if you develop all of those, even if you're not exclusively focused on, the main reason I flag it as different is because the obstacle is different. If your country is, for example, really focused on a certain type of agriculture, a bad growing season is going to utterly cripple your entire economy, not just that one industry. The reason that we want diversity is for robustness. If your country has a proficient agriculture industry and manufacturing and service economy and some natural resources on the side, it's very hard to find a single economic event other than a global financial crisis that's going to take you down. Whereas if your country is exclusively focused around one single thing, the impact of a negative market or a dropping share price in that one commodity is going to devastate a much larger area of your economy. So, for example, if you're an OPEC country that was really heavily focused on the price of oil, then once that price of oil started to drop and you started to make less profit per barrel, that was a really big problem for those economies. As we moved more and more in the development of green technology, energy companies that are relying on fracking or the production of harmful fossil fuels are going to be less and less desirable in the market, and they're not going to have anything to supplement that with. When are we giving this session to, by the way? I don't know what the time limit is, because it's already 6 o'clock.
No, they're getting some
5 more minutes. Okay. Shit, we're like a third of the way through the slides. Sorry?
You put the slides up, like,
On the Facebook.
I can, but they won't be particularly useful without my commentary. All right. Very quickly, landlocked countries. Being landlocked is not inherently bad. Being landlocked with crappy neighbours is really, really bad. If you are a landlocked country, you really need to be able to trade with the countries immediately around you. So, for example, Uganda is currently reliant on the infrastructure of Kenya, Sudan, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania if it wants to have a functioning economy. Who has been on holiday to any of those countries? Yes. So, again, look at Switzerland, surrounded by wealthy European nations that it can trade its service industry with, much more likely to develop. So that's a trap that countries commonly find themselves in, and that's a reason why a country might be interested in being part of a trade union rather than having an isolationist development policy. If its economic success is dependent not only on its own infrastructure but the infrastructure of its neighbours, that's a very key reason why it's self-interested in developing its neighbours and not just itself. Thirdly, conflict. Duh. If there's a war going on in your country, it's really hard to develop it. The solutions for this one are rarely trade and aid, like most development debates. This is where military elements start to come in. But just one piece of commentary that often gets ignored in debates is that the statistical links between countries that are in serious conflict and having low growth, low average income, or an over-reliance on natural resources are much, much stronger than the links between a country that has massive ethnic tensions or religiosity or lack of it, or polarizing ethnic diversity. As debaters, we tend to blame historical and religious conflicts for a lot of the problems in countries that are constantly warring. The evidence actually suggests it's got much, much more to do with the strength of the economy than a conflict of religious ideologies, for example. Just some food for thought when you're plotting these arguments and debates. And lastly, bad governments. We've already talked a bit about corruption. Having courts that can hold your government accountable, having a legislature that is independent from its executive, having strong institutions to check the power of a corrupt government is also a very important thing for the development of a country. And, you know, characterising Zimbabwe as very ethical or not at all trustworthy is a great way of selling a particular development model over the other. Aid. Very quickly, the way aid is characterised in debates is usually exclusively, here's a pile of money, do stuff with it. Different ways you can characterise aid when setting up your model for debates. One, is it going to be a grant or is it going to be a loan? Most debaters will almost always go with grants. Private actors or China tend to focus exclusively on loans. Secondly, you can give that money either straight to the federal government or you can distribute it to specific actors or communities within that country. These are all things to consider when setting up your model. Where is that aid going to be most useful? Thirdly, and this is the one that most commonly pops up in the topic, is conditionality. Do we just give the money and request that the country use it for the betterment of its people, or do we wait for them to achieve certain economic or political indicators before we even consider handing over the cheque? That's a clash in a lot of debates, and we've already spoken sort of about the difference between trade liberalisation and protectionist policy. This is sort of above that, which is kind of, do we wait for proof, or do we accept the reality that that country is never going to be able to meet those standards without aid, and trust the ethics of that actor to distribute the money or use it productively? Yeah. So, for the extreme lefties in the room, aid is not the solution to all global poverty problems. Studies by the World Bank have shown that there are very diminishing returns on giving aid to a country. Like, if they've got literally no money, it might be useful, but it tends to cap out at around 16% of GDP. Any money above that in aid tends to do very little to help a country. It's like pouring water into a cup that has a bunch of holes. It's not going to be able to quench thirst. You need to resolve the actual structural problems to get the most out of that money. So in a debate, when the solution is calling for aid, if you can characterise a country as like already having resources, already having access to capital, then you can dispute the usefulness of that aid as a solution. You can instead focus on the problems and needing to resolve them in order to make that money go further. And lastly, if a country does spend a lot of money on its military, giving them aid is likely to also give them a lot of money to spend on its military. About 40% of military spending in Africa comes from foreign aid, and about 11% of the aid given to Africa is used for military spending. So characterise how the country will use that aid, not just what its problem, not just what it needs is as a goal of more money. You need to be able to prove in a debate that it will be used constructively, or if you're the opposition, that it won't be very effective to just give more money. You need to fix the core problems first. We're rushing here. All right, trade. This is the big one. And it's the one that's being like thrown into crisis at the moment by a lot of isolationism from Western countries like the UK and the US. So why is it necessary to trade in a global economy? Why can't you just produce everything you need in a single country? Firstly, is if you don't have a domestic market. If you're in the early stages of development, there probably aren't a lot of people in your country who could afford flat screen TVs, which means you can't build that industry to manufacture them. So trade offers access to a market to sell your goods if you don't have like a high consumer base. Secondly, reciprocity. Probably the main reason that countries enter into free trade agreements is they agree to get rid of their own protectionist policies in exchange for other countries similarly getting rid of their own trade policies. That's another subgenre of debates where it's sort of like the liberalism versus the government-driven approach, but on a global scale, should we require all countries to be exclusively free traders? And thirdly, strategic reasons. Economic development is only one of the reasons countries enter into a free trade agreement or agree to certain financial deals. The other reasons are like political, strategic. China right now, has anyone heard of the Belt? What's it called? Sorry? The Belt Road, is investing a lot of money in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, loans that it's pretty sure it's never going to see a return on. Instead, it's building them to get strategic partnerships with those countries in order to set up naval bases and create what it's calling the string of pearls. What the West is calling the string of pearls, a military shipping installation in the south, in the sea below Asia, so that it can monitor shipping routes. Yeah.
Just briefly on that, they're currently wrestling about investing in Vanuatu. They basically put out like this huge loan to the Vanuatu government, which is like, you're going to be able to make this huge international airport. It's coincidentally right next to their new naval base in Vanuatu. Okay, and they're like, oh, we'll give you this huge loan. Oh, also, if you default on it, oh, we'll just take it back, no worries. So they're like building something for a government, gaining credit, and then if the government can't pay back, they just get it anyway.
Yeah.
It's a tricky way to put it.
So countries enter into like disadvantageous trade or financial agreements if there's a strategic reason to do so. Flip side of that is a lot of countries in Southeast Asia were excited about the TPP, specifically because it excluded China and it would bond them closer to the United States. They were worried about the emerging power and influence of China in the region and wanted to be able to sort of quell its trade dominance. So if you're in a debate and you're having difficulty justifying why your agreement or your policy is good on a financial level, try and do it on a political or strategic level. Where is it a problem that you enter into a free trade agreement? Number one is if it makes you uncompetitive. US agriculture would not be anywhere near profitable if it wasn't subsidised by the government and exported at a really cheap price because of it. Secondly, it might obstruct the development of other industries. For example, coffee or heroin are like very expensive crops that you can sell for a lot of money in a developing country, much more so than like food that could feed the local population. If there's a food crisis in your country, you as the government probably want to step in and force farmers to make grain that will feed your own people more than coffee beans that will be exported to the Western markets for a hefty profit. Yeah.
Just on that, it's not just about forcing them to make the right types of crops. So during Ethiopia's famine in the 1980s, where like hundreds of thousands of people died, they were a net exporter of food. It's just that the people in Ethiopia couldn't afford to buy that food at the same rates that Western markets could. And so the food that was made there, that was in front of them, goes away.
Yeah. That's what we call an export restriction or a strategic export policy, where countries deliberately try and like sell food for higher prices to specific actors, even if that comes at the expense of making it free and available within their country. That's what China's largely been doing with its rare earth over the past 10 years, is it's been artificially limiting how much of that it exports to the world economy. Because it essentially has a monopoly over that, it's been able to charge much, much higher prices and stifle the economy, the development of certain countries with that. The final problem with trade is it really only works if everyone does it. The ideal scenario for you as an individual country is everyone else agrees to give up their protectionist policies and government subsidies, but you still get to do yours, which is sort of like what America is literally trying to do at the moment, right? And so the reason that we enter into agreements like the WTO is as a way of enforcing that equal trade, that equal fair trade, by making sure that all countries agree to abide by it. But there are some times where that's disadvantageous. Everyone know about like intellectual property laws and why that's making medications in Africa really expensive when they're produced in the United States? Yeah? So that's a reason why you might want to like break these free trade agreements, right? Is because that's very disadvantageous for you and it's very protectionist. So reciprocity is key to making trade agreements successful, and in debates you might be sort of saying, you know what, let's give up on the WTO because it's just not working. Much controversy surrounds the current international institutions because the United States and Europe have very explicitly protectionist policies. Europe has something called the Common Agricultural Policy, which basically means it's okay to subsidise your own farmers in those countries. Obviously, that makes them much, much more competitive than farmers having to work without any support from their government in Ethiopia or in Sudan. Does that make sense to everyone? Who's heard of the prisoner's dilemma? Yeah? It's like that. It's sort of like, I want to be able to stab you in the back, but the risk is that we'll both stab each other in the back, so we need to agree to sacrifice a little for the greater overall good. That's what you're trying to prove will happen if you're pro-free trade organisations or pro-unions. Cool. And that's, yeah, very recent joke that's pretty similar that's pretty, like, descriptive about the event. So that's everything I've got on slides. I think that we're almost out of time, so does anyone have questions or specific topics or specific areas of knowledge that they want to address while they have me here? Or about anything I've just said? Or topics that you still hate? No? Ask questions. Or go get pizza. No? Alright. So, who can tell me the neg case for allowing countries to buy and sell votes in the international arena? Who's got an argument for the negative in that debate? Yeah. Buying and selling votes in international arenas.
So, when you say international arenas, do you mean like they're buying and selling them?
International organisations, like the WTO, anti-whaling organisations, OPEC, ECOWAS, why should we let countries buy and sell their votes in these areas?
You want for or against?
Against.
Just rich countries just buy all the votes, right? Make things in favor of whatever they want.
Yeah, but if you're a poor country, you want their money, so you're selling them a commodity, right?
Those governments will have short-term incentives and not look into like the way that those policies will help them long-term.
Yeah, possibly.
When you buy those votes, you're not necessarily buying them by doing really good things for those countries. It might be doing really good things for the family of the rulers of those countries, for example.
Cool. Well, if no one has any questions, and I'd be very surprised if you think I've covered everything about global trade and development in half an hour, then, yeah. Is it pizza time? Or? Yeah. Flee. I mean, I can make these available if you want, but they're... Which one are you after? I don't know. Hang on, I need to check something.
Yeah.
Which slide did you want? No. Forrest has a copy. Share them on the Facebook page, I guess.
Like conflict over who owns the resources. Could you say that colonialism comes into that?
I mean,
or is that something else?
Probably. Colonialism started a lot of the tribalism and factionism by arbitrarily drawing lines on a map. But in terms of whether it's still responsible for keeping them going, probably not so much. It's about the self-interest of very small parties who don't see a path to developing the whole country or unity within that entire state. You can blame them, but you can't really make them do anything now as a result.
Yeah.
I reckon the question will come up.
Yeah, after the debate.
Oh, yeah.
The good news is that a lot of this exists in more detail on the YouTube page of Mad. Sonreich, Tim Yoda Sonreich with...
This is the one where, like, the people sitting on either side of the...
Yeah, that was our Australs training weekend.
Which year was that?
That was my first Australs, which would have been 2011, I think? 12, maybe? Yeah, so a while back. Sonreich is Yoda in that he literally has 900 years of wisdom and wizardry, actually. Cool. So you can share those slides if you want, but there isn't actually a lot of material on them. I said most of it out loud.
We're going to also record it anyway.
Yeah. The biggest thing to take away from the slides themselves, I think, is to like look at the examples that I've included in the slides, like Gujarat, and find some more detail.
Well, if we're going to do a case for effect file, what will be the most efficient way of doing it? I'm supposed to do it country by country, which is like tedious.
Like
Areas, regions?
It doesn't necessarily need to be like. You sort of need two examples. You need the historical example which proves this formula can work. Okay. So, ignoring aid packages when they came with strings attached, you've got the Asian tigers. Like Malaysia recovered faster than Thailand by ignoring the Washington Consensus and not receiving the aid in exchange for that. You then, when it comes to like trying to characterize that in the real world, what you need for the country you're currently debating in is less here's what we've done in the past, and more, here are the conditions that are in favour or against that approach.
Yeah.
So, where's Australs this year?
Malaysia.
Malaysia. So you might...
ASEAN, for sure.
Sorry?
Something
Something to do with ASEAN, yeah. So you might have like this isn't about trade and development, but I had, when I did Worlds for the first time, I had a Ukraine page, which was sort of like pro-West, pro-Russia, with like a division down the middle. So you might want sort of like that, like reasons why trade liberalism would be good for these countries, trade liberalism would be bad for those countries. And you can probably twist the facts of that into most debates.